Over 100 years ago, the people who lived in these cottages were a bit shorter than I am, but also they absolutely hated their neighbours. And the question is, why? Well, this is a story of betrayal, bitterness, tragedy and injustice spread over 200 years to the current day. And it all started when I found these ruins on a nearly 200-year-old map of Ireland, and I decided to investigate them. The first question I had was, why are they here in the first place? We are nearly 300 meters up above sea level. There are no other cottages in this area this high up. Why are they here? If you look down there, there are loads of green fields and open space down near the coast. It's just not the sort of place that if you had a choice, you would choose to live. And as I discovered, the people who live here didn't have a choice. So the question is, what is it that drove them up here? And why did the people here hate their neighbours so much? And that's what we're going to try and unravel in this video. First of all, let's head back down the road that leads up here. I mean, I said road, it's more of a dirt trail up into the mountains, and I can't imagine that 200 years ago this actually looked any nicer. But here's the weird thing. This trail road, whatever you want to call it, is on the opposite side of the river, the gorge, from where the cottages are, where people actually live. There are no cottages on this side. Almost feels as if they were deliberately isolated on that side of the valley. There isn't even a bridge to cross the river. There's just this ford. So in really bad weather in the winter, if this is really flooded, they would be completely cut off. Ooh, that's a bit uncomfortable. Now we gotta go up around here. This really would not be a great place to live if you were elderly. Okay, so from here you can see there are two homesteads. There's cottages, one over there and one higher up over there. We're going to go to the higher up one first. This is the upper cottage, the upper homestead. It's further on up the mountain by probably maybe 20 meters in altitude. It's much smaller than the other one, as we're going to see. There's only a handful of buildings here. Oh, that's interesting. Look, 1, 2, 3 alcoves. Initially I thought rocks had just fallen out of there, but they haven't, because you can see there's a rock across the top. There's lintels. So there's 3 little alcoves quite deliberately in whatever this used to be. If I had to guess, there's a little shelf, maybe to set a candle or your mug of tea or something. Maybe. You can tell just how rocky the ground would have been up here by the number of stones used in this wall and the number of stones used in this building. Because when whoever lived here came here for the first time, this would have just been an absolute boulder field, and it would have taken them potentially years to slowly clear all the boulders and all the rocks off it, to build all their different walls and make space that maybe they could grow crops on or keep animals. Ground's very boggy. Here's something that caught my eye the first time I came up here, and it's that this structure here seems to be made of different stone than the other structures. Our structures look like they're just made from stones that have been found in the fields, whereas this looks like it's been made, well, it has been made from quarried and dressed granite. I mean, look how square that is. That's been chiseled and chipped and dressed and shaped and done properly, and there's mortar holding this building together. So I think this structure is probably much newer. I mean, it's probably still at least 100 years old than some of the other ruins that are here. It's really hard to tell what those buildings would have been at this point. My guess is at least one of them would have been a house at some stage. And the others maybe used for housing animals or outsheds or something like that. This structure, this was definitely a house. And you can tell because of that. That is a fireplace. Piece of a sheep. There is a very, what I'm going to call a bleak beauty right up here. It's got like a rugged, oldie-fashioned charm to it. But I feel like that's just rose-tinted goggles of nostalgia for a life I never led. And the reality is that living up here was probably not a pleasant existence. I mean, it's the start of February. It's about 4 or 5 degrees up here. There's a cold wind blowing through. It's just unpleasant. If it was raining, it would be miserable up here. And the thing that would make it even worse is that because sort of clouds stick to mountains, you could be up here sitting in gloomy Clag, looking down to the coast where people are still in sunshine down at the green fields far below. So when I think about it that way, living up here really doesn't appeal, but we're gonna head down now to the slightly lower and more sheltered settlement, which is a lot bigger than this one. Ah! I've just realized that I left my food, my sandwich, my dinner down in the van 2.5 miles away. Well, I guess I'm going to get a realistic enactment of just what it was like to live up here with not much to eat. I'm such an idiot. You see, the buildings down here are much higher quality than the ones up on the top, which either means people lived here for longer, or they were just better at making buildings. In fact, most of the structures down here, the stonework on them looks similar to that one possibly newer building up there. But if you look from above, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 buildings or rooms right in this area, and then there's a couple of smaller ones up the top. So this is a much larger settlement. I find abandoned places like this quite often when I'm out and about, and I'm always curious who lived here. If only there was some way to find out. Well, as it turns out, there was a survey, a property survey done around the 1850s called the Griffith I can't pronounce it, the Griffith Report. But that survey has been digitized and is online, and you or anyone can search it. And that is exactly what we did. The problem is that to find out who lived here, you need to know the name of this townland. So this is a complicated process, but allow me to explain it. There's a web page that lets you find out the name of the townland. So you go, you have a look, and I found out that this is known as the Glasdrummond townland. So you take the name Glasdrummond, the townland name, you plug that into the Griffith, this is going to be a recurring theme, into the survey website. You find the right one, in case there's multiple, and then you click on occupants, and boom, you have a list of 103 records. But at this point, you still have no idea where these people actually lived. But we're not done yet, because then what you have to do is you click into one of the map views, wait for ages for it to load, and then when it does load, you've now loaded up a historical map from the 1800s with the plot numbers on the map. So you zoom in, find the location, in which case this location, find the corresponding number, in this case it was 50, and then go back and click into original page, and this is the original report, and then search for that plot number in the left hand column, and there we have it. The occupier's name at the time of that report was Mary Skillen, and her upper neighbour on plot 51 was John Quinn, and her lower neighbour was John McCartan. How cool is that? And you can use that method to find out the historical ownership of essentially any plot of land in Ireland, as well as also find out who lived there. And once you have those names and the dates, you can then start cross-referencing marriage records and newspaper archives. That's sort of the basis for doing this stuff. One thing I should point out at this point is the name Quinn, because what we discovered was the people that lived up there were the Quinns, and it was spelt Quinn, the way you would expect. But they pronounced it Queen, because there's some records where it's written down as Queen. So obviously they've said, my name is Queen, and someone's written down Queen, but it was actually Quinn. So Queen and Quinn were kind of interchangeable. We found the same was true with Skillen. In other places you would find it written down as Skelling. It's a little bit of a quirk from a time when not everybody was able to read and write, and that included their own names. So far, well, a little bit meh. I found out some names, but I hadn't really found anything that interesting. And that's when I decided to pull out the big guns and I contacted Gary. Not that Gary, the other Gary, my mysterious researcher Gary friend. This guy just loves trawling through this stuff more than I do. He's got a lot more patience than I have, and Gary has been brilliant in pulling stories like this together. So I gave him all my findings so far, and he went and dug, and what he found made this so much more interesting. Whew, that's quite deep. Well, Gary went looking through all kinds of records. He looked through wedding records, he went through newspaper archives, and it was in the newspaper archives that he discovered something. He discovered an article from July 1909 that involved a court case between the Quinns and the Skillens. And the story goes that Samuel Skillen was by the river one day, fishing, trying to catch a fish in the river, and along comes James Quinn. And they dispute what actually happened, but maybe words were exchanged. There was an accusation that a fishing rod was swung at somebody as a weapon. But whatever happened, James Quinn then stormed off back down to his house, got his brother, and they came back up with sticks and began to blatter the living daylights out of Samuel Skillen. Samuel Skillen's father then hears the commotion. He comes out, he brings a stick, he gets involved and starts blattering the Quinn's sons. The mother of the Quinns, she hears the commotion, she comes out, she takes the stick off the older Skillen and starts blattering him with it. And other family members come out and they're grabbing rocks and they're chucking them at each other, and it just turns into this pitched battle of people having stones thrown at them and being hit over the head with various implements. And eventually the Skillens flee back down to their homes, and this entire thing ended up in court. And the funny thing is that in the actual record of the event, there are lots of places where the audience in the court are laughing. I mean, the older Skillen, I think, was it William? He ended up needing to see a doctor afterwards. He had quite a bad cut on his elbow and he was all covered in bruises on his head. So these people actually really hurt each other. This wasn't just a minor scuffle, this was a serious fight. So I think I can confidently say that the Quinns and the Skillens didn't get on. I mean, this had to have been the sort of thing that had been festering for a while to turn into like a full-on pitched battle like this on the hillside. And the question is, what is it that made them dislike each other so much? Maybe were they trespassing each other's land? Had some of them stolen from each other? But then we found out something that could have been a source of friction between these two families, because we discovered that they didn't actually always live up here. Gary, the researcher, had found hints of some kind of tragic event that had led to the families actually living up here. He wanted confirmation of this, so he decided to go back and went through his own archives. Now I imagine Gary has got some kind of dusty room covered with photographs on the wall and red string connecting them. But he eventually found a book, a small thin book from the 1970s. That book contained the story of how the Quinns or the Queens and the Skillans ended up living up here in the first place. And I think that will be the perfect tale to tell around the campfire. This is the only food I actually have with me because I forgot my lunch. It's a little active snack. Peanut butter, energy mix. I'm so glad I had that. I had it in a different pocket. But sitting down in the van waiting for me is a delicious M&S chicken and bacon sandwich on malted brown bread, and I'll be having that when I get back down to the van. But it's amazing the difference to your mood. A little bit of heat and a tiny little bit of food can do. I'm using this little stove here. I've got it on a rock so it won't make any scorch marks, and I brought one of these fire logs with me. One of these will burn for about an hour, and it means I don't have to use any wood. So it's about as leave no trace as you can get for quite a lot of heat. This is a story all about how the lives of the people who lived here were turned upside down because they didn't want to live here. They used to live down near the coast, and they lived down there with 8 families in total in this small town, this small settlement on an area of land known as the Graback Field, and that would have been sheltered, it would have been warmer, it would have been out of the winds, the ground would have been much flatter, more level, just a much nicer place to live than up here. But they didn't own the land, they only leased it. It was owned by the Thompson family, and one day the Thompson family decided, actually, we want this land for our own use. Maybe we want to cultivate it and grow crops, something like that. We don't know exactly. But they decided they wanted the land, and so they evicted every single family that lived there. And so in 1824, the Polans, the McCartans, the Skillans, the Quins, the Carrs, the Fitzsimmons, the Grahams, and Cromwells were all forced out of that town. The homes were levelled, and a lot of those people were forced up into the mountains to inhospitable terrain to try and live. Like, it's horrendous. And the story goes that as they were leaving their homes, they stopped at a bridge over a river and they cursed the land that Thompson had forced them from. And as the story goes, that land was never cultivated. So nobody who lived up here actually wanted to live up here. They were forced here. Forced from a much nicer location up into the hills, and I can't help but wonder, is that maybe where the friction came from? I mean, imagine it. How did they decide who got what bit of land? It's not nice up here at all, and the higher up you go, the worse the land is. And the Quins, they ended up higher up. It's not as good up there, it's not as sheltered up there, and the Skillans ended up down here. This is a much nicer piece of land. How was that decided? Did they toss a coin? Was it just a race up here? And did the outcome of that, is that what caused some of the friction? Or was it just that the loss of their homes left them broken and bitter and just on a hair trigger of anger? Trauma can sometimes do that to people. The buildings down here are much nicer than the buildings up there, or at least they look like they were at some point in time. Was there jealousy? Now, the actual fight at the river didn't happen for 85 years after the evictions. The evictions were 1824 and the fight was 1909, I think. But I still think there could be a connection. Those circumstances that forced these families up here, or even just the harshness of living up here, led to and created resentment that spread over years and even over multiple generations, and that eventually resulted in that fight by the river. And yes, at the end of the day, it is speculation, but I think it's hard to deny that the events that led the people up here are not events that are going to make you feel particularly positive about life. What we do know is that they weren't happy to be living up here on the cold, wet, windy hillside. And that was where I was originally going to leave this story. And then Gary found a living relative. And that living relative was a descendant of the Quinn family. And what we found out is that the Quinns, or Queens, lived up there for multiple generations, and the family got bigger and bigger. The land couldn't support them. There wasn't enough work. And eventually, like many Irish people at the time, a lot of them had to leave. Some of them went to Liverpool, and then some of them went from Liverpool to Australia. But that's not the interesting bit. The most interesting bit is that in 1929, about 100 years after they were evicted from their home down by the coast, there was an economic crash. The Thompson family were forced to sell their land for cheap, and that included the Graback field, and guess who bought it? The Quinns. And to this day, that land down there that the family had been evicted from 200 years ago is still in their possession, and some of their descendants and relatives live down there today. How cool an ending is that? Now, I know some of you are going to be asking the question, hey Stephen, you haven't finished this mystery. What happened to the Skillings, or the Skellings who lived in this house? Well, the answer to that is, we have absolutely no idea. But if Gary ever figures that out and it turns out it's an interesting story, well, maybe I'll make a sequel. But anyway, hope you enjoyed this little story. Thanks for coming up into the hills with me. I found this a fun one, especially as Gary did most of the research for it, all the heavy lifting. This video has been in the works for probably over 6 months since I came up here and camped with my tiny tent way back in, is it 6 months? I can't remember, September, I think. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on my next video, which is going to be it's going to be a camping trip, but a camping trip that's a little bit bittersweet. So I'll see you on that one. Bye bye.